Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Economics and Society webinar series hosted by Students for Liberty Europe and FEE. Tonight, we are excited to have Lawrence W. Reed for his second session, The Promise of Privatization. Larry Reed is the President Emeritus of FEE and one of the leading voices for free markets and individual liberty. Through his decades of leadership at FEE, he has inspired countless people to think critically about the role of government and the power of voluntary solutions. In today's session, Larry will walk us through why privatization works, how private ownership and competition can better serve public needs than government, and how free markets unleash innovation and efficiency. As always, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box below. We will answer them at the end of the session. Please join me in welcoming Lawrence W. Reed. Over to you.
Okay, thank you, Vinayakan, and also Students for Liberty. I appreciate this opportunity very much. And once again, I want to put in a quick plug for the ESFL conference in Prague. If you haven't yet signed up, I hope you will. I look forward to seeing many of you there in about 6 or 7 weeks at the end of April. Well, the topic today is the promise of privatization. Now, I remember, believe it or not, I'm old enough to remember this, when privatization wasn't even yet in the dictionary. And it appeared in the first dictionary, I think in the 1980s. Maybe it might have been in a few places in the 1970s, but the 80s was when it really started popping up. And actually, I remember for the first time seeing it in a dictionary. But it's a very important topic because if you believe in liberty, and I assume that's the one thing that brings all of us here together today, you have to have a strategy for getting there, especially if you are presented a situation where a country has not had anything or very little privatized. Government is all over the place. And now finally, there's a consensus to move in another direction. We have to have some sort of a strategy that says, well, here's how to get there. I remember before privatization developed as both a theory and then as a practice, most of us in the libertarian movement were spending almost all of our time complaining about the inefficiencies of government. They were all around us, and government was growing everywhere. So we were constantly saying, don't do this, don't do that, or this is dumb, this costs money, this is too expensive. And we didn't have the luxury until maybe the late 1970s or 80s of actually being in a position where we could say, now that we have a consensus, now that we know we need to shrink the public sector, here's one way to do it. And so that's why privatization is important. It isn't enough to simply complain about big government. We've got to say, once you've got it and you decide it's time to unwind it, you have to have some procedures and plans and strategies in place that will get it done successfully. And privatization is one of those ways to shrink the size of government. If I had to give you a definition for it, a very broad one that describes all the various forms that it takes, I would say privatization is simply the transfer of assets or services from the public to the private sector. The transfer, and of course that raises questions itself, how do you do that transfer? We'll talk about that. But it is the transfer of physical assets, plant and equipment, machinery, whatever it may be, mines, oil wells, it could be any number of things, from the public sector or government to the competitive private sector, okay? Transferring those things from public to private. That's what privatization is. Now, how do we do it? That requires me to offer you some forms that it can take. And I'll give you some examples along the way. Probably the best known form of privatization is called contracting out, sometimes called competitive contracting. This is where the government says, okay, we used to do this service typically ourselves, with our own government employees, and taxpayers paid for it. But now, instead of us doing it, we will write it up and put it out for bid, and a private company or companies or even a nonprofit that offers the best deal will give it to them. And under contract, the government will get the job done through those private entities, nonprofit or for profit. That's the most common way that it is done these days at all levels of government, especially state and local in the United States. In Europe, my guess is something similar has been happening, that it's probably more common the more local government is. It's always tougher to do it at the national level. But contracting out, I remember, well, I think I'll save that example for a little later, but that's one way to get it done. And as you'll see in my subsequent lecture, there are right ways to do that and wrong ways to do it. But we'll get to that in a moment. A second way to privatize is to engage in commercialization. Commercialization is a form of privatization. It's actually the one that I like personally the best. Commercialization is when the government just says, we're out of here. We used to provide this, used to be our function, but we're not even going to contract on your behalf. We're just going to quit doing it. And you, the consumer, go out and if you want that service, you figure out how to get it done. Now, that may sound rather daunting, but it's actually easier in many cases than you might imagine. For instance, I recall when I lived in Midland, Michigan for years, and then briefly moved to Colorado in 1984. I was so accustomed to the way my town in Michigan took care of garbage collection. That is, the city did it with its own employees, its Department of Public Works, that when I moved to Colorado, I just sort of assumed that's the way it was done there. And so I moved into a house in a neighborhood, and I remember asking a neighbor when I saw him, what day does your garbage get picked up? And he said, Thursday. So I said, oh, okay, I'll remember that. So I put my garbage can out at the curbside on Thursday and came home from work and realized that his garbage had been picked up and hauled away, but not mine. And I thought, what? I thought he did say Thursday and his is gone. So when I saw the neighbor again, I said, hey, I thought you said garbage gets picked up on Thursdays. And he said, well, yeah, mine does. I don't know when yours comes, but we don't have city garbage pickup here. Look in the phone book, you'll find lots of private companies. You have to find one that you want to contract with and find out when they'll come. It might be Friday, might be another day of the week. Well, you might think, oh, my reaction must have been, oh gosh, another piece of work I have to do instead of just letting the city do it for me. But no, my reaction was, wow, I am empowered. This is great. I get to pick who picks up my garbage. And so I asked around, tried to find out, looked online or checked with people who were reviewing garbage pickup companies. I finally picked one, and it turned out they came through my neighborhood on Wednesdays. But I really thought, wow, that's great. And if they don't do a good job, guess what? I don't have to go to a boring city council meeting presided over by politicians who don't want to hear what I have to say, and waiting in line to say something that only makes them unhappy. If the company that I contracted with doesn't do the job well, I can fire them. I can fire them without having to go to some city council meeting. So I felt empowered to be in charge of something as small as privatizing my garbage pickup. Well, freedom consists of lots of components, all kinds of little spaces in our lives. And when freedom is lost, it's often lost one little space at a time, as opposed to one fell swoop. Well, freedom can be regained one small piece at a time, too. And I thought in that instance, I had regained some freedom that I should never have been denied, the freedom to choose who I wanted to pick up my garbage. Well, that's commercialization. Some people will say, well, that can't work everywhere. If you're stuck way out in the country somewhere and there's only one company that could possibly bid, maybe it won't work there. I always say, don't sell the market short, because a lot of companies know that even though for the moment they may be the only one, that if they misbehave, they could simply be inviting somebody else to come in and take business away. But it clearly it can be done with less risk, less concern in some places than in others. But wherever it can be done, I think commercialization is the best. It gets the government out of it altogether. You don't have to worry about bureaucracy, about taxes, about it's all a personal choice instead of a political one. Another form, a third form of privatization, is asset sales. And obviously this refers to a physical object like a truck or a snow clearing machine, or anything physical, plant and equipment that may be owned by government. Maybe the government decides we really don't need this anymore, or there are better ways to get it done. We should get out of this business altogether. So now we're going to sell the equipment that we no longer need. Well, that's a kind of privatization, getting assets out of the hands of government and putting them in the hands of people who will pay something for them because they are of value, and they will likely put that asset to better use anyway. Now, another form, a fourth, of privatization is the use of vouchers. And we think of this probably more often in education, but it really can be applied in many other lines of work too. But a voucher is where the government says, okay, we may or may not continue to do this activity, but we're certainly not going to prevent private entities from entering this line of work too. And instead of forcing everybody to pay for us to do it, we're just going to give people a voucher. And you can redeem that voucher at the provider of your choice. As that would work, say, in education, that's where instead of you being assigned to a government school in the neighborhood where you live, you could be given a voucher where you could go take it to the school of your choice and redeem the voucher there. Sometimes it could cover the full costs. Other times it might be half the cost or somewhere in between. You make up the difference. But at least what you have with vouchers is more choice than you have with a government monopoly that says you have to buy this service here from us and no place else. Some people say, well, no, we've always had private schools. Yeah, but historically that means that a parent who chooses a private option ends up having to pay twice. They still get hit with taxes for a public system they don't particularly want to pick or choose. And then, of course, if they choose a private alternative, they have to pay tuition there too. So they get socked twice. Vouchers kind of takes care of that, at least partially, by saying, here's a slip of paper, take it and redeem it at the provider of your choice. A fifth form of privatization is just ending subsidies. Okay. Why is this a kind of privatization when government just says no more subsidies? Well, it takes a private industry and just says to it, you have to hereafter rely on voluntary customers, not taxpayers. For instance, a good example of this, which was done very quickly nationwide, comes from New Zealand back in the 1980s. The New Zealand experience in the mid-80s continues to be one of the best examples in recent history of a government that decides big time, we're going for privatization. They had become a socialized society with heavy government expenditures. Agriculture in particular was, although it was still private, it was heavily subsidized. So farmers before the mid-1980s in New Zealand, they produced stuff that the government wanted produced, not necessarily what customers wanted to be produced. So the government just said, no more subsidies. If you want to be a farmer, fine, but you have to grow for the market, not for us, not for politicians. And you have to find out what consumers want, sell it yourself, best price you can get, but no more subsidies from us. It did cause some short-term disruptions. Some farmers found, wow, I've been growing stuff that just because the government said it would pay me if I did, even if there wasn't any or very little market demand for it. Now I have to pay attention to the market. So that makes a private industry more private. It makes it more market focused. It makes it more attentive to customers rather than politicians, simply by ending subsidies. Then that industry or that company becomes a truly market phenomenon, not a political one. A sixth form of privatization is the sale of stock to the public, the sale of stock. Margaret Thatcher did this a lot with the privatizations she undertook in Britain in the 1980s. This typically involves a government-owned enterprise that the government finally decides it shouldn't be in, and so now it wants to get out of that. How does it do it? Well, this is one way. Margaret Thatcher, for instance, privatized British Telecom. She privatized Rolls-Royce. She privatized the management of 7 major airports in Britain, largely by this method. She said, we're going to sell stock. And whoever buys stock in this formerly state-owned or government-owned company, they will now be the owners, not the government. And once all the stock is sold, then we, the government, are out of it. And the company is answerable now to private shareholders, not politicians. Margaret Thatcher also understood that the way you do this can be crucial to its success. And she was a genius in this regard. She could have just put British Telecom and those other companies up for sale without any stipulation, without any provisos for who could buy first, and just throw it out that way. But then you would have the left scream bloody murder. They would say, oh, look, only the rich people can buy shares of stock. This is just a handout or a subsidy to the rich, and you know how that goes. And of course, you might even have the public employees up in arms against it because they're thinking, we don't want to be owned by a private person. We like it being government employees. So Thatcher had to think about how are we going to get the government employees to not oppose the privatization of this state-owned company. What she did was she offered the stock for sale first to the employees. She said to the government employees, just to give you a rough example, she said, we expect this stock to probably sell for $100 a share when it goes public. But if you're a current worker in that company, that state-owned company, there'll be a period of time where we'll let you buy shares of stock and we'll sell it to you for $75. You get it at a discount from what we think it is worth. That gives the workers an incentive to say, wow, yeah, if it's going to be worth 100 almost instantly, I'll gladly buy a share of the very company I work for. And that quieted a lot of potential resistance to the privatization. A lot of workers said, hey, I know we can do better if we were managed privately. And this makes, this kind of sweetens the pot for me because I can buy shares. I'll have a say in how the company is run. I can sell my stock as soon as it goes up if I want to. That was a very smart way for Thatcher to do that. And it neutralized a lot of potential opposition. And a final way to privatize, I guess this is number, 7, is it goes by an acronym, ESOP, Employee Stock Ownership Plans, ESOPs. This is a form of number 6, but it's where the employees themselves initiate a change in ownership of a company. Now, maybe it's always been private. So this is just one private form replacing another private form of ownership. But I'd like to throw it in here because it can be done with state enterprises too. This is where a company says, hey, to the employees, hey, do you want to buy the company? go ahead. You can reorganize and buy all the stock in it, and you don't even have to sell it to the public if you don't want to. Just the workers can buy it, and the workers can then be the owners and the managers. That's a kind of privatization, especially if it's done that way with a government enterprise. Okay, well, those are the forms that privatization can take. And it's not an exaggeration to say that for much of the last 40 plus years, there has been a kind of quiet revolution of privatization. Not much was going on in the decades before, about 40 years ago, but now it's happening all the time, all over the world, sometimes by big national governments and quite often by the state and local, county and city governments. So it's no longer seen as a rare thing that might be dicey or risky. It's in the dictionary now, and it has been done both successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully. We'll talk about that in a moment. After the Soviet Union fell in 1989, we saw a lot of privatization in the subsequent years in Eastern Europe and in the many of the former Soviet republics that were now independent countries. When it was the old Soviet Union, those governments owned almost everything, and we know how incredibly stupid and inefficient that was. So, largely for ideological reasons, many of those countries jumped headlong into privatization after 1989. So, if I were to say, why does it happen? Why is privatization happening? I would say, well, one reason can be ideological. If you're, say, Poland, 1990, newly liberated from being a Soviet satellite country, you want to privatize just for the heck of it because you're sick of government owning everything and doing it terribly. That's just so a lot of countries just said, we don't believe in state ownership anymore. We believe in things like competition. And when you privatize something, at least a private firm has stronger incentive to deliver the service well or go out of business if it doesn't. So for ideological reasons, some places adopt privatization. I'll give you a hypothetical example. Actually, it's not entirely hypothetical, but I remember a few years ago when the city of Dayton, Ohio, the city council government, entertained a proposal for the city to open several pizza parlors, pizza restaurants. Okay. And you're thinking, what? A city getting into the pizza business? Well, fortunately, they ended up deciding not to do that. But let's say they had. Let's say they decided, yeah, the city taxpayers are we're going to have them pay to open a bunch of pizza stores in Dayton, Ohio. That would be an example of the need to privatize for purely ideological reasons. I wouldn't need any more reason than ideology to privatize those pizza parlors. I would try to convince people, hey, look in the phone book. We have lots of pizza providers that are private. They're competing with each other. You got Domino's, Papa John's. What do you need city government in pizza for? Can you imagine any government having in its mission statement, our mission as a government is to provide for the public safety and pizza? I mean, that makes no sense. What do they know about pizza? So even if Dayton could somehow make better pizza as a city enterprise than the private providers, I would say get it out of that business anyway. There are lots of other choices. And if the city gets into pizza, well, then it's likely to neglect some of its other more important duties. You don't want any entity to be in so many things that it doesn't do anything very well. So I would say there's no reason for a city to be in the pizza business. Just look in the phone book, and you'll find if there are private providers listed in the phone book, that's good enough reason for me not to get government in that particular business. So ideology sometimes is a reason to privatize. Another reason why it's happening is what I like to call the tax wall. The tax, T-A-X, wall. Governments sometimes hit a tax wall and they can't raise taxes anymore. Maybe there's a statutory or constitutional limit that they've reached and they can't raise taxes. Or maybe their politicians have got the message from voters that they don't want higher taxes. So if the politicians want more money, they're going to have to find another way to get it. And so when that happens, sometimes governments will privatize, not because they really want to, not for ideological reasons, but just because they have to. They can't raise taxes anymore, and yet they got to cut expenses somewhere. So they say, we're going to sell this, or we're going to get out of that line of work, turn it over to the private sector because we can't afford it anymore. Okay, well, that's a good reason, and often explains why it happens. I think probably the most common reason why it happens is the third one, and that is, I guess for want of a better term, I would say pragmatic reasons or pragmatism. Not for ideological reasons, not because they've hit some tax wall, but because the government says, you know, we're just not the best outfit to do this. There are plenty of others that can do it. And right now, this line of work needs new investment. It needs new technology. And we don't have the skills or the knowledge or the expertise here in government to achieve that. But private companies often do. So a lot of privatizations happen for that reason, because the government says, you know, this line of work now, it just exceeds our understanding, our knowledge, our technology. We wouldn't know how to do it in a competitive world that we now have. So instead of continuing with our antiquated and costly ways of doing this, we're just going to turn it over to the more efficient, technologically superior private sector. Okay, and they also sometimes know that if they do that, they'll get more tax revenue because private companies will do the job better. They'll be on the cutting edge of technology, and they'll make a profit at it and pay some taxes. So that's kind of a pragmatic reason to privatize, because government, instead of something costing it money, it might actually make some by letting a private firm do it and pay taxes in the process. So those are the reasons why it happens. Now let's look at a little bit about where. Right now, privatization is, there may be no other country where it is being talked about more at the moment than in Argentina. And that, of course, is because of the new president, who's been in office now about 15 months, Javier Milei. He very much understands and believes in free enterprise, the private sector. He inherited an Argentine national government that was hopelessly inefficient and out of date and corrupt. And so he knows that privatization has got to be an important tool to get Argentina back on the right track. Now, I have to give him credit because he did not stress privatization in his first year. He, I think, realized that there were other more important priorities, such as getting inflation down from way up in the triple digits. He's brought it way down to, if not yet single digits, it's not far into the double digits, and that's a huge reduction. He needed to get inflation under control first, and also needed to get the Argentine government budget in balance. He produced a balanced budget within months of taking office. Now, why were those things important first before privatization? Well, you know, with almost any form of privatization, you've got to be able to attract capital, whether it be from people here at home or from people overseas. You want capital to come in to help to purchase a company or to infuse new technology into it or whatever. But you're not going to attract capital if your country is an absolute chaotic mess. If you're running triple-digit inflation, if you've got massive state enterprises that are so hopelessly inefficient and high taxes and all that stuff, you know, you got to fix that before you will be seen as an attractive place to put an investment. Well, Milei has made a lot of progress in that regard. So he has recently, starting this past September, said that privatization now is on the table, and the big push for him in the next year is going to be privatizing state activities and enterprises. In fact, I have a little detail for you. In September, President Milei declared that the country's government airline, well, I sure wouldn't want to have to fly in a government airline if I could avoid it, but it was called Aerolíneas Argentinas. It had been private years ago. Then it was taken over by the Kirchner government, and now President Milei wants to turn it back into the private sector. And why shouldn't he? I mean, what is it about government that suggests, whoa, they know about flying planes better than other people? They don't know anything about that. So he announced in September the national airline will be put up for sale, and they're working on the process which will bring that about. It's been running a deficit every year since former President Kirchner nationalized it in 2008. And President Milei said in September, why should Argentines, including those who have never flown in their lives, pay for this atrocity? And he said that it was unacceptable for the government to keep subsidizing an airline while 66% of children live in poverty. Well, that's a pretty good argument. Then in January of this year, he announced the government had completed its first privatization of a state-owned company. It wasn't the airline yet, but the company known as IMPSA was privatized, and it manufactures turbines, cranes, reactors, other equipment for the metallurgical, energy, and technology sectors. That's now privatized. And only last month, President Milei announced that they were going to privatize the state-owned company that manages the country's highways. Now, there's something you think, oh, highways, isn't that supposed to be entirely a government function? Well, Milei doesn't believe that, and he doesn't think that it has to be. And the company that has been, or the government department that's been doing it, runs an annual massive deficit. And so they're going to transfer management to private firms, more than one, through an international bidding process. So bidders will come forward and say, we'll do that. We'll work on those highways. We'll own this one, subsidize, or not subsidize, but finance it through tolls or whatever. Probably will be a diversity of means by which this is accomplished. But Milei is going to get the government out of the highway business. So keep an eye on that in coming months. In the United States, there has not been very much privatization at the national level. That might soon change. It's always been toughest to do at the national level because, you know, privatizing something may benefit people in, say, California, but they don't want to have to jump in a plane and go all the way to Washington to lobby for it. So who does go to Washington to lobby on it? It's the existing state entities or the labor unions or whoever has a vested interest in the status quo. But now the Trump administration is floating ideas that have the word privatization involved. President Trump himself even said he's thinking about privatizing the post office. Wouldn't that be a remarkable thing? I mean, I know some people throw up their hands and say, what? That's always been a government function. Well, that's not true. What's been a government monopoly has been the delivery of first-class letter mail. But we have lots of private companies in existence that compete in the delivery of other things, other classes of mail, including packages. You have Federal Express, and in the past you've had Airborne, and you have UPS and so forth. So don't tell me that only politicians or people they appoint know how to deliver stuff. That's ridiculous. And of course, the market has already been putting the U.S. Postal Service slowly out of business anyway. A lot of things that you and I used to get done by putting a letter in the mailbox. Now we do online. And so, it may be easier to privatize what's left of the post office today than it was 50 years ago. But that might happen. We've seen a lot more privatization at the state and local level in the United States. It's happening all the time at those levels. In fact, I think it's happened now so many times, thousands of times, that there is not a function of a government anywhere in the country that hasn't been privatized in some form by some government somewhere. So we have examples of just about everything I can think of: solid waste collection and disposal, garbage, county jail management, road and street maintenance, tree trimming and planting, snow removal, the management of fleets of government vehicles, parks and recreation, legal services, you name it. We have cities in the United States now that are called contract cities, where almost no city employees are involved. In Georgia, where I live, just up the road, we have Sandy Springs and Dunwoody. They've been doing this for 15 or more years. They have almost no city employees. I mean, they're cities of 100,000 or more people, and yet their city workforce is just, maybe 8 or 10. And the reason is they're now called contract cities. The city employees they have simply monitor the contracts that are put up for bid and then carried out by the companies that won the bids. So it changes, something like this, changes the nature of local government away from actually providing services, and instead it puts them in a position of being monitors of service. They're the ones who say, they write up the contracts and they say, here's what we'd like private companies to do. Who would like to do it? We'll go with the lowest and best provider. And then we'll make sure by monitoring your performance that you do as you promised. Sometimes when a privatization has failed, you look back and you discover, well, they didn't write the contract properly, or they put it out for their friends to bid on and kept everybody else out. Or the private provider started to get sloppy and the monitors in the city government didn't watch it, didn't monitor the contract. So it's not so much the fault of the privatization as it is in the way it was designed or the way it was enforced and monitored. But now that sort of thing is happening all over the place. Indianapolis, 20 years ago in Indiana, was one of the pioneers in this. And the mayor at the time, who was a big advocate of privatizing things, he came up with a unique way to do it. He privatized dozens of services and assets in Indianapolis, but he would tell the public employees, we're not just going to fire you and put this out for private bid. We're going to let you reorganize, if you want, into an entity, a company, if you want, and you can be one of the bidders on the service that you used to provide as a government monopoly. And something like about a third of the contracts were won by reorganized groups of public employees who came in and said, hey, we can do it better as a semi-privatized entity. It's amazing, studies have been done on this, to show how the mentality of those employees changes when they go from working for a government monopoly to now being competitive providers of a service. All of a sudden they start to think, oh my gosh, we got too many people doing this. We don't need that many. Or some of those stupid union rules that kept us from changing a light bulb until the right guy came. We can get rid of that crap. So all of a sudden they have an incentive to find ways to get something done better and cheaper, or they lose the bid, you see. So you change the nature of incentives, you can change almost anything. Well, I need to work this towards a conclusion, and the way I'll do it is to say, I want to give you an example of how this can be done in education. Privatization can be done in education in ways that you might not have thought. I mentioned vouchers. That's one way you could do it. You could privatize the provision of education through the use of tax credits or other ways too. But when I was running a think tank in Michigan and we started to look at this, we thought, how are we going to get the public to think of education in different ways? They think it has to be done by government employees and that every aspect of it has to be done as if it were a government monopoly. So we thought, well, wait a minute. Education in government schools involves a lot of things these days. They're not just teachers teaching kids, but also cafeteria workers who are feeding the kids at lunchtime, bus drivers who are busing the kids to school and back, custodians who clean the floors, and so forth. Well, in Michigan, they were all government employees too, just like the teachers. So we thought, the best way to get the public thinking in the right direction is to start on those ancillary or non-instructional aspects of education: food service, busing, custodial. And so we started doing studies showing how those things could be done cheaper and better if you put them up for competitive contracting. But then we found that under state law in Michigan, contracting out for those school support services was not legal unless the teachers union approved it. And of course, they're going to say no because they're the same union that has unionized the bus drivers and the cafeteria workers and the custodians. So we made a case and government changed and actually passed a law taking those things off the table. So a school board could thereafter contract competitively for all that stuff. And in effect, it meant that a school board could say to the teachers' unions, we have to talk to you about teacher salaries, teacher pensions, things like that, but we don't have to talk to you about how the floors get cleaned. We don't have to talk to you about who buses the kids to school or who feeds them at lunchtime. If we find a private firm that will do that better and cheaper, we're going to contract with them, and you can't even raise it at the bargaining table. You're a teachers union, not a bus driver union anymore. Well, what happened was in Michigan, school boards all across the state started looking into these other services being provided by private competitive contractors. And they've done it now thousands of times, saving lots of money that can be put to use in the classroom. Or some school districts have said, hey, let's take the savings and give it to the taxpayers in a tax reduction. A lot of things you could do with those savings, but no longer do we think, at least in Michigan, that everything about education has to be done by the government. How medieval, how Stone Age is that kind of thinking. So with that, I hope I've said enough to get you thinking that privatization is a tool. It can be a very useful tool if it's done right. And if we do it with care, and that we really need to, as taxpayers, tell every entity of government, if you haven't at least looked into it, if you haven't at least considered it, you're not doing your job. And I'll also add this real quick, that I could give you many cases of where a government decided, okay, this service we've provided for years, we're now going to put it up for competitive bidding. And then all of a sudden, the public employees say, hey, don't do that. Keep it with us. And if you do, here's what we'll do for you. And they come back and say, well, we can find ways to, we'll cut this, we'll cut that, we'll improve service, we'll show up for work on time. So just the threat of privatization, the thought that you might do it, can cause public employee behavior to change in a more positive direction. That's why every government should at least consider it for just about everything. Thank you very much. And I think we have maybe 15 minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, Laurie. I have we haven't started receiving the questions. I think people will start posting it in the Q&A. I have a quick question to you. One of the things, like you were mentioning the example of Argentina, he had a specific strategy how to privatize, at what time the country need to do that, and how to prioritize that decision. Um, so I've recently read an article saying that like copying that to a different country, like for example, USA, would be a disaster. So how should policymakers look into that aspect of privatization with respect to the context of each country? How well they can adapt and how to strategize that?
Yeah, I think President Millet, so far, to my knowledge, I think has made it plain that he doesn't care so much who might provide a service in Argentina. He just wants the best provider to have that opportunity. So he, I think, would welcome foreign investment. There are some services, I'm sure, in Argentina that might be best provided by a company or companies from, say, Chile or the United States or Great Britain, or who knows, why limit it to investors within your country? You're just denying yourself some possible opportunities for lower costs and better services. But you have to make the economy across the board an attractive place to invest. That means if you've got counterproductive exchange controls, get rid of them. If you've got a different set of tax burdens for foreign investors than you have for domestic investors, you need to think about getting rid of that, treat everybody equally. You need to deregulate, get rid of red tape and paperwork, make your economy appealing not only to foreign investors who might say, let's put our capital to work there, but also those things have the same effect on domestic producers too. Free the economy so that capital can flow in from wherever it may choose to come.
Another question which people might have is regarding the maintenance of rule of law. Like people generally assume policing or jail management should be government run because it is associating with the monopoly of violence argument. Like the government has the monopoly of violence, so those kind of acts would give um, like like incentives to the private players who are running those institutions. How do you
Yeah.
see that?
Well, one of the core functions of government, I think, that is very defensible is that it should, in a broad way, provide a safe environment for people to go about their business in peace. And that implies things like a police force, laws that are clear to everybody, fair in their application, and not capricious, arbitrary, or corrupt. But once it takes on that function, I think it should recognize that it doesn't have to monopolize the way that function is carried out. For example, related to justice at home is the function of, say, national defense. We've got to keep people safe from aggressors from abroad. Well, that doesn't mean that the government should own every factory that makes tanks and planes and guns. I mean, I don't know about you, but if I need a gun, I would feel a lot more comfortable if I thought my gun was made by a private, competitive, chosen by happy customers operation instead of some government monopoly. I want it to work whenever I need it. So in the United States, we have a national defense function, but we don't have government tank factories. The government buys its tanks and its planes from private providers, and it gets better tanks and better planes because of it. And if a private provider cheats in any way or does something that's unsafe, the government has an immediate recourse to take them to court. And so often, if your only option is a government provision of something, and you have to sue because they didn't do a good job, the government stacks the deck against you. You may never get redress of your grievances because you're fighting the government at every turn. But even in the provision of public safety, you have a lot of private activity. In fact, don't think of police as the only safeguard against violence and aggression. I mean, a company that makes padlocks, they're involved in safety, right? I buy a lock and put on my door. I don't have to go to the government store and buy a government lock. I get a private one. Lots of ways in which private competitive provision helps to make for a safer society. So even the most core function of government, provide for public safety, does not have to involve government monopoly. It can be maybe paid for through government, but could be provided by private competitive firms.
We have a question. How can government prepare people for privatization? Also, there is this question of like, there is, if, say, for example, in the garbage management, if a firm fails for a while, like the firm which was providing, and if there is a like single player and the player fails to do that, during
Yeah.
that time, this is an essential service and that need to be fulfilled by companies. Like um, that argument often comes up.
Yeah. I guess I would say two things the government has to do to prepare people for privatization. One is education. If you've got a society where people have been told for years that things like profit are evil, private companies are rapacious, and they just take stuff and they rip you off, and that mentality has to change. And to the extent you've got politicians catering to that mentality, they got to quit doing that. People have to understand that profit's not a bad thing. It's, in fact, a loss. That's a bad thing. I mean, and any moron can incur a loss, right? That doesn't take any brains to run a company into the ground. But to run it in such a way that it actually adds value to society, which shows up then as a profit, that's a good thing. It's good for everybody. So we have to make sure the population understands the importance of the pillars of a free economy, like the profit motive, private entrepreneurship, competition, and that kind of thing. And then the second element is transparency. The government should, if it's about to embark upon a privatization effort, it needs to tell people, we're going to put everything out in the open. Nothing's going to be secret. We're not going to privatize by handing something over to our friends who supported us in the last election. None of that crap. We're going to be as open about it as possible from start to finish. That can encourage public confidence, but you do it behind closed doors and you favor some of your friends instead of others. And that's happened in many places. That's a prescription for failure and public hostility.
I think we have no more questions. And it was a great session. And yeah, final answer really clear. We have one more question from Paul. Please go ahead, Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Hey, Larry. It's good to see
Paul,
you.
old
How have
friend.
you been?
Great.
Yeah,
You?
it's been in some time.
Yeah.
I went to go see my town's mayor today because last Tuesday, my town decided to take over our private fire department.
Huh.
And it was an absolute wrong step in the wrong direction. And I said, why would you do this? And he said, well, I'm a big free market capitalist guy. Right. Okay. Well, why would you do this? And he gave me some of the lamest answers you can imagine. And unfortunately, what we see is that our side has really, really good answers. Like if you're a customer, all I'm worried about is quality of service and the price. I don't care about your HR. I don't care about your IT. I don't care about how you make the sausage. Just give me a good quality service at the right price. That's all I want to be focused on as a customer. But now that we've taken it over, we've got all of the HR headaches, all of the IT headaches.
Yeah.
And what we see is that the politicians who are voting on this, they have so thin arguments.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe because you've got so much experience in this, how, even though we have really good strong arguments, it's really not our arguments that are losing the battle. It's really just like persistence and such. How have you been able to overcome these sorts of just weak kneed politicians in your experience? Because you've been on the front line for all of this.
That's always a challenge. And thank you, Paul, for raising it, because it does deserve some attention. Boy, what yet another reason to keep government at all levels small, huh? Our founders had it right, because politicians are not known for their wisdom. Sometimes they're just building empires. They just think, oh, I get to be in charge of this department now if we do it ourselves. Well, I suppose there are different ways to go at that. One, with regard to fire protection that you raised, I would say, wait a minute, are you aware that there are still hundreds of townships and counties and towns in America whose fire departments are entirely private, that are manned by volunteers? Yeah, I grew up in Chippewa Township, Pennsylvania. We always had, still to this day, they have a volunteer fire department. It doesn't have to be a for-profit company that runs it. It's volunteers. Wherever that's possible, hey, hallelujah. But there are also for-profit fire protection companies. The town of Scottsdale, Arizona, has been around for decades. They have never had a public or government fire department. And yet you look at studies have documented this. You look at insurance, fire insurance in Scottsdale versus where fire protection is provided privately. The fire insurance premiums are less than they are in nearby cities where governments provide fire protection. And why? Because the private companies that provide fire protection, they're on the cutting edge of technology. They give customers a discount. Hey, if you do this, you put this sprinkler in, put it here, we'll cut your insurance rate. Or, they do various things to not only please the customer, but to cut their costs and to be the most effective fire suppressors out there. So I would say to somebody like the man you talked about, I would say, have you studied these other examples? I mean, how can you go headlong into this dubious direction when you've got so many other good examples that you haven't even considered? If you want, I'll fly some of these guys in to meet with you. So I would kind of shame them into exploring something they probably haven't spent 5 minutes actually thinking about or looking into. That's a start.
Paul, do you have a follow-up, or can we take one more question? If Peter has one, we might slightly go over time. Is it okay for you, Larry?
Oh, perfectly fine. Yes.
Yeah. Peter, you can ask a question.
Hello, first of all, thank you for this interesting session. I'm from Georgia country, and
I could tell by your name. I have
so good.
in Georgia.
And as we know, after the Soviet Union fell, in Georgia, government started to privatize many sectors. So it doesn't go good. And my question is that how can we avoid like these problems with oligarchy and non-developed countries? And my question was also, how can we prepare people for this privatization? And how can we avoid this oligarchy problems with this privatization?
Yes, very good question. It sounds like at least some of the privatizations in Georgia may have been a little corrupt, may have been carried out by politicians who steered a contract in the direction of a friend instead of truly competitive contracting. My guess is that that is the source of some of the issue. I would say every single service or asset that your government has privatized would now be a very good case study. Uh, why did it succeed or why did it not succeed? Chances are you will find that in the instances where it didn't succeed, it was because they didn't write the provisions of the contracts properly. They didn't enforce them. They didn't monitor the contracts carefully, or they gave them to their friends in the first place who had much less incentive to get the job done right.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the best way to fight that is to publicize those failures and try to educate people that, hey, privatization is great, but not when it's done this way, because then it gives it a bad name. Um, so it's just an ongoing battle. Since Adam and Eve, we've had to fight to explain why we need things like choice and competition and transparency and efficiency in everything we do. Um, so I'm sorry it didn't work in some cases, but I'll bet it was because it wasn't done right. So you just have to educate. In Georgia, I know you have. Uh, I can't think of the name of the group at the moment, but in Tbilisi, Pata Shashalidze and Gia Jandari. I don't know if you know them, but they are involved with a free market think tank in Georgia. I know them well. They brought me over there, in fact, to do some speaking. And they are busy trying to educate people about how markets really work and how things like privatization can be made to work right. So maybe get involved with them and help them spread the word.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer.
If you have trouble locating them and want to, just shoot me an email and I can connect you. My email address for you or anybody listening is lreed at fee.org. And my website is easy to find too, lawrencewreed.com.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurie Reed, for this another beautiful session. So excited to meet you in Prague soon. Um, Jan, do you have any thing to add?